On the morning of June 27, 1944, two roads west of Bobruisk stopped being roads. They became a parking lot for an army. German trucks, staff cars, artillery tractors, ammunition carriers, and the remaining tanks of the 20th Panzer Division stood jammed bumper to bumper near the Berezina River. Men leaned from cabs, engines overheated. Officers waved columns forward toward crossings that were already slipping out of reach. Then the sky filled with Soviet aircraft. More than 400 planes came over the road system in a concentrated strike. Il-2 Sturmovix dropped low over the columns, firing cannon and rockets into vehicles packed so tightly that one burning truck could stop everything behind it. The German Ninth Army was not about to lose another position. It was about to lose the ability to move. 6 days earlier, that army still occupied what appeared to be one of the quieter, more stable sectors of the Eastern Front. It held the southern shoulder of Army Group Center in Belarus, anchored around Bobruisk, a road and rail junction on the Berezina. On a map, Bobruisk was only a town. Operationally, it was a hinge. The roads through it controlled the river crossings. The crossings controlled withdrawal toward Minsk, and Minsk controlled the route farther west into Poland. Whoever reached those crossings first would decide whether the Ninth Army escaped as a fighting force or disappeared inside a pocket. German commanders believed the main Soviet summer offensive would strike farther south against Army Group North Ukraine. That was where they kept much of their armored strength. Belarus was treated as the secondary front, important, but not the place where the Red Army would make its decisive effort. Soviet deception reinforced that belief. Troops, artillery, fuel, and bridging equipment accumulated opposite Army Group Center under concealment while German attention remained fixed elsewhere. The weakness was not only intelligence, it was doctrine. Adolf Hitler had declared Bobruisk a fortified place. The city was to be held, not traded for time. A fortress commander could not simply withdraw because the tactical situation had changed. The order was supposed to harden the front. Instead, it removed the one freedom the Ninth Army would soon need most. Movement. Operation Bagration opened on June 22 and 23 across hundreds of miles of front. 4 Soviet fronts struck Army Group Center almost simultaneously. Their targets were not random stretches of trench. They were the hinged cities holding the German system together: Vitebsk in the north, Orsha and Mogilev in the center, and Bobruisk in the south. The pattern was brutally simple. Break through on both sides of a fortified city, drive behind it, close the ring before the garrison receives permission to leave. Then let the fortress order do the rest. The southern operation belonged to the 1st Belarusian Front under General Konstantin Rokossovsky. His plan for Bobruisk nearly cost him his command. Soviet doctrine favored one overwhelming breakthrough on a narrow axis. Stalin expected Rokossovsky to choose a single main effort. Rokossovsky insisted on 2, one thrust north of Bobruisk, one south of it, both moving toward the German rear. Stalin sent him away to reconsider. Rokossovsky returned with the same answer. He was sent away again. He came back with the same plan: 2 main blows. His reasoning came from the terrain. Rivers, forests, and marshes restricted movement around Bobruisk. One Soviet thrust could be contained and counterattacked by a defender operating on interior lines. 2 simultaneous thrusts would force the Germans to divide a reserve they barely possessed. Stalin finally approved the plan. The decision mattered because the Ninth Army had only one meaningful mobile reserve in the sector: the 20th Panzer Division. 1 reserve, 2 crises, and no permission to retreat. The northern blow was assigned to General Alexander Gorbatov's 3rd Army. The southern blow went to General Pavel Batov's 65th Army. Batov faced ground the Germans considered unsuitable for a major attack: swamp. German maps treated the marshland south of Bobruisk almost like a natural wall. The positions behind it were held lightly because heavy artillery, trucks, and tanks were not expected to cross in strength. That assumption was the opening Rokossovsky needed. Soviet engineers moved with the assault troops, laying corduroy roads, logs and timber placed over the wet ground to create temporary surfaces. Infantry crossed first, guns followed. Then vehicles and armor rolled through terrain the German command had labeled impassable. The map said the swamp was closed. The engineers opened it. On June 24, the attack began under an artillery preparation involving thousands of guns, mortars, and Katyusha rocket launchers. Around 7,000 weapons across the Bobruisk attack sectors by widely cited Soviet counts. The bombardment did more than tear apart forward trenches. It struck command posts, artillery positions, and telephone lines. German units did not simply lose ground. They began losing the ability to understand what was happening on their flanks. When the fire shifted deeper, both Soviet arms moved. Batov's 65th Army drove through the marsh sector and advanced toward the Berezina crossing south of Bobruisk. the same crossings the Ninth Army would need for any organized withdrawal. The impossible ground became the fastest route into the German rear. In the north, Gorbatov's Third Army pushed the German 35th Corps westward. The fighting was harder there. German infantry resisted from prepared positions, but the pressure kept forcing them toward the river. By the second day, the Ninth Army was not facing one breakthrough. It was being folded inward from both sides. The German command now committed the 20th Panzer Division, but not as one concentrated blow. First, the division was sent toward one threatened sector. Then it was recalled and redirected toward the other. Tanks, half-tracks, fuel trucks, and repair vehicles spent precious hours moving along crowded roads while the two Soviet penetrations deepened. The division burned fuel in countermarches instead of delivering a decisive counterattack. By the time it was finally committed, the gaps were too wide, the Soviet spearheads were too deep, and the armored reserve itself was being drawn into the pocket it had been ordered to prevent. This was not simply one general making a bad choice, it was the mathematics of the situation. Two Soviet thrusts, one German reserve, a rigid front, and a city that could not be abandoned. Any response to the north weakened the south. Any response to the south weakened the north. The German command was trying to solve a two-handed attack with one moving piece. On June 27, Soviet spearheads met west of Bobruisk. The ring closed. Inside it, east of the city and pressed against the Berezina, were tens of thousands of German troops from the 35th Corps and the 41st Panzer Corps. Estimates vary, but roughly 40,000 men were caught in the immediate pocket as the two pincers linked. The river was behind them. Soviet forces were across the roads ahead, and the fortified place order had held them in position long enough for both facts to become permanent. The fortress had not protected the army. It had become the wall of its prison. The trapped commanders understood that waiting meant surrender. General Kurt-Jürgen von Lützow gave subordinate formations freedom to break out toward the northwest and toward Bobruisk itself. That decision came late, but it was rational. The problem was geography. Only a small number of roads could carry heavy vehicles, artillery, and tanks toward the river crossings. The pocket's entire mechanical mass began funneling onto the same two routes. Every truck, every gun tractor, every fuel vehicle, every tank still capable of moving. Thousands of men on foot joined them. The roads narrowed the whole army into two dense columns, and Soviet reconnaissance saw them. The 16th Air Army committed a massive strike. Soviet accounts describe more than 400 aircraft, with some figures exceeding 500, attacking the road columns and crossing approaches. The Il-2 Sturmovik was built for this kind of target. It was not a graceful aircraft. It was an armored attack machine designed to work close to the ground. Steel protection surrounded the cockpit and engine. Its cannon could tear through trucks, artillery tractors, and lightly armored vehicles. Rockets and small-shaped charge bomblets could strike the thin upper surfaces of tanks and vehicles. Against a dispersed formation, those weapons required opportunity. Against a traffic jam, opportunity was everywhere. The first vehicles burned. The wrecks blocked the road. The blocked road trapped the vehicles behind them. Ammunition trucks detonated. Fuel carriers ignited. Drivers abandoned cabs. Men scattered into fields and tree lines while aircraft came back over the same stationary targets. One destroyed vehicle did not remove one vehicle from the column. It stopped dozens more. That was the mechanism of the disaster. The airstrike did not have to destroy every tank or kill every soldier. It only had to make the roads unusable. Once the roads stopped moving, the breakout stopped being an army operation. It became thousands of individual escape attempts. Artillery was abandoned because horses and tractors could not pull it through wreckage. Tanks ran out of fuel or were left behind when routes closed. Small groups tried to reach the Berezina on foot. Some swam. Some crossed in darkness. Some slipped through gaps. But formations did not escape intact. The Ninth Army's men could still move as individuals. The Ninth Army could no longer move as an army. German command changes came after the decisive moment. General Hans Jordan was relieved and replaced by General Nikolaus von Vormann. The official blame centered partly on the handling of the 20th Panzer Division. But von Vormann inherited a formation whose eastern half was already encircled, whose reserve had been consumed, whose communications were collapsing, and whose roads were burning. Changing the commander could not reopen the crossings. It could not unspend the fuel. It could not turn two Soviet pincers back into one. Soviet forces compressed the pocket over the next days. The Third Army and supporting formations pressed from the east while the 65th Army held the western exits. Soviet armor exploited every break in resistance, overtaking columns and cutting smaller groups apart. Bobruisk fell on June 29 after fighting inside the city. With the town and its crossings lost, organized resistance east of the Berezina collapsed into isolated pockets, surrender and flight. The casualty figures differ across accounts, especially in how they separate dead, wounded, missing, and prisoners. But the operational result is not in dispute. The German Ninth Army ceased to exist as an effective formation. Tens of thousands were captured. Vast quantities of artillery, vehicles, and equipment were destroyed or abandoned. Only fragments reached German lines to the west, many without heavy weapons and without the command structure that had organized them a week earlier. That distinction matters. Bobruisk was not simply a battlefield where one side killed more men than the other. It was an encirclement that destroyed movement first. Once movement failed, command failed. Once command failed, units became crowds. And once the roads and crossings were gone, surrender became the final stage of a process that had started days earlier in the marsh. Rokossovski had not designed a larger frontal battle. He had designed a trap. The artillery opened the seams. Batov's engineers turned swamp into road. Gorbatov's armies forced the Northern Corps toward the river. The two pincers took the exits. The 20th Panzer Division was pulled apart between them. Then the 16th Air Army turned the breakout routes into wreckage. Each element solved a different part of the same problem. The Germans were not defeated by one weapon. They were defeated by a sequence, and Bobruisk was only one part of the larger collapse. At Vitebsk, Orsha, and Mogilev, other German formations were also held in or near fortified cities while Soviet forces drove around them. The defensive system of Army Group Center did not break at a single point. Its hinges failed almost together. Within weeks, most of the formation had been shattered. Dozens of divisions were destroyed or reduced beyond immediate use. German losses across Operation Bagration reached into the hundreds of thousands, and the Red Army advanced through Belarus toward Poland. The stable front had vanished. Not because every trench was stormed from the front, because the positions holding the front together were bypassed, sealed, and reduced one after another. At Bobruisk, two decisions met. Rokossovski chose movement on two axes. Hitler chose immobility at one fortified city. One plan assumed terrain could be changed, roads could be built, and pressure could arrive from more than one direction. The other assumed a line became stronger simply because withdrawal was forbidden. The battle proved which assumption belonged to modern war. The Germans believed the marsh could not be crossed. They believed the roads behind Bobruisk would carry them to safety. Rokossovski reversed both beliefs. At Bobruisk, the swamp became a road, and the roads became a prison.